Here with me today is Ryan McConechy, Chief Technology Officer at Barrier Networks. With over 20 years of cybersecurity experience, Ryan uses his experience to support clients with technology implementations and the execution of comprehensive security programs. In his role as CTO at Barrier Networks, Ryan is responsible for developing and delivering complex security programs to suit his clients' needs, developing them or helping them to meet their business objectives and critical regulatory compliance requirements. Ryan, the stage is yours.
Okay, I'm going to take off my headset because it's a bit weird for me. Again, yeah, apologies for the change. I am not buzzword compliant, so sorry, we'll press on. I'm going to struggle to follow that intro because it was quite big, and I'm going to come to you with a very low level and very simple starter. So we'll just kind of jump straight in. So I want to keep this vendor agnostic. I'm not going to talk about any specific products. I'm going to talk about product sets available, what I know of in the marketplace, and I'm also going to talk about potential pitfalls that you might see. There'll be maybe room to talk about products later, and obviously if you do want products, come to Barrier, great. So I'm talking about OT and what makes OT so special that we want to talk about it specifically. Well, there's a couple of things we need to understand about the OT networks, and some of you already know this if you're working in OT. Availability is key, it's king. When you're dealing with systems that could result in potential loss of life, danger of injury, hazards to the environment, we need to take the availability of the system a lot more seriously. Things like this, the CIA triangle, you'll be maybe familiar with this. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. In OT, we're flipping this upside down. Availability is the important thing, and so I'm keeping this in mind with the recommendations I make. We've got a slower pace of change in OT because there's less maintenance windows, a real focus on production. You might be running 24/7, so being able to change stuff doesn't present an opportunity as often. Industrial protocols within the networking sphere, there are loads of these, and they're not always the easiest things to work with. There's also a general lack of end-to-end encryption, which, depending on your point of view, that could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. Risk aversion, and I'm highlighting this one, this is something that I come across all the time in OT networks. The aversion to making a change because of the impact on production, and there's just a general fear of it. So what I'm going to bring to you takes account of this risk aversion. And lastly, cybersecurity kind of coming late to the party here. Digital transformation might have brought your OT network online, and it was maybe never meant to go online, but that's where we're stuck just now. And so your system's a lot more exposed, and it's important that we try and now bring security to the party. So the things to consider that I'm going to put forward, there's lots to talk about, but these are my 3 key areas I want to talk about. Visibility, and this is my important one. I'm going to go on a bit more about that in detail. If you can't see it, you might not be able to secure it. Segmentation, bringing in controls and enforcement within your network. Once you see what's there, you want to be able to control it. And the last one, this is a bit cryptic. I'll explain what I mean later. So we're going to set some traps. A bit on why do we want to do this. I'm going to get to the meat of the technical stuff later. We're talking about a worst case, but it's a very feasible worst case. We're talking about a breach. If you don't protect yourself against a breach, you're probably going to look a bit silly. There's plenty of stories in the media. I won't go on about those. If you choose to do security, and I advise that you do, funnily enough, you do it on your terms. If you decide to implement something, you decide the budget, or you have the budget decided for you. You decide when you do it, you decide where you do it. If you're breached, the decision has been made for you. You're doing it now very quickly at the expense of extreme amounts of budget, or maybe the organization suffers severe reputational damage or what have you, but you get to decide the timescales of security if you implement it. Compliance, if you don't take the adequate steps to protect your assets, there's a good chance you might be fined because of that. There could be legal proceedings against your company if you are responsible for supply chain, for example. Security could be mandated, and if you're not doing it, results could be bad if you don't. And the last one, as I said, you control the budget, you control the spend. When someone pops up with a ransomware payment, for example, you don't get to control what they're going to charge you. You might find that that figure is far in excess of what you would have spent on the security in the first place. Going to give everyone a big warning. We've got a boring slide coming up, so I want to make sure everyone's paying attention, no one's falling asleep just now because you might not make it through the next one. Realistically though, it starts off boring, but hopefully you'll gather my enthusiasm and understand why what I'm about to talk to you is really important. So thank you for bearing with me here. Got the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture. Is everyone still with me? Can I see a show of hands of people who are familiar with this concept? Perfect. That's actually what I want. Very few of you, and that's great because this model carries with it a fair bit of dogma that I want to dispel a wee bit. I want to just take a second to look at the examples there. These are two things that are describing the same model. Okay, clicker doesn't work. So looking round about the middle there, the left one describes a DMZ. The right one doesn't. So we've got two things that are talking about the same concept, but they don't disagree with each other. And that's why I really want to highlight reference. This is not something that you want to follow to a T. There'll be those of you who maybe heard of it, you might be thinking, I'm going to make my network Purdue compliant. Don't do that. Please don't do that. You'll tie yourself in knots trying to do it. I've come up with a very simplified version of it. This is just my take on it. Consider it as you will. The white text bits, that's the IT network. Not so much what you're concerned with, but it's there. It's the source of where stuff's going to come into your OT network. You've got your IDMZ level 3.5, it gets referred to quite commonly. That's typically going to be you'll find some shared services in there. That's how your OT network and IT network are going to talk through a controlled conduit. And then 321, I haven't labeled 0 here. That's the physical world stuff, and it's more than likely not IP enabled, but it will be eventually. I'm not going to spend any more time talking about the levels. It's just to give you an idea. The Purdue model also brings this concept of level-to-level communication, and this is where we're talking zones and conduits. Is everyone still awake? Okay, good. A level could contain one zone or many zones. A conduit is traffic going between zones. That's simple. Think about these concepts. These are good concepts. Keep those in mind. Purdue model wants you to think traffic shouldn't be going from 5 to 1 directly. There should be intermediate steps. Ideally, you want to have it going 2 to 3, 2 to 1. One step if you can, but this is the part of the model that if you tie yourself to that, you're really going to struggle to implement an OT network because the applications don't work like that. The equipment doesn't work like that. It doesn't conform to this model perfectly. So I bring to you my shortcut. First of all, I've flipped it upside down and I've made it a pyramid because I like shapes. At the top, we've got level 1, and that I want everyone to think of as the most secure zone. That is where you least want an attacker to be. Every zone below it is less secure. When you're thinking about a zone or a level, you want to consider the level beneath it to be compromised when you're thinking about security, because that's where the compromise comes. They come up the pyramid to try and get to your crown jewels in the OT network. So we've got a concept here, and this is an NCSC thing. It's probably other frameworks might mention it. Browse down. Traffic is going from a more secure level to a less secure level. Browse down, and that's why I had to flip it upside down so the guidance makes sense for everyone looking at the picture. So we're browsing down. Good. Happy. That's going to be the most secure. we've de-risked it as much as we can from a conceptual level, because the level that's not been breached might be talking to a level that has been breached, but the comms go to it rather than from it. Lower likelihood of something getting into your more secure zone. Browse up, do you want to take a guess? It's not as good, but it's running in the opposite direction. You're not going to be able to avoid browse up, but just keep in mind that try and think about things in a secure by design fashion. Then we've got this bad boy here. So server in your DMZ is talking to a PLC. No, please never do this. If you could take away one lesson, please never do this if you can. If any of you are familiar with Shodan, online, Google it. You can go on there and see a list of devices that are accessible from anywhere on the internet, and there are PLCs listed there. So you can go on and mess with someone's processes somewhere else in the world if you want to. Again, please don't do that for legal reasons. That's a joke. The guidance, stop and think. Levels, zones, conduits, these are good concepts. Don't form a strong opinion about how this should be done perfectly, because you've got an OT network right now. Hopefully those sitting before me have an OT network, otherwise this might be a bit wasted. You want to secure that. You want to bring in security. So getting the right mindset before you go in, it's a good thing. Think about what needs to communicate with what else. So moving on, I want to try and teach you all to become OT superheroes. To get secure, you're going to need supervision. So you can supervise your network. Okay, back to serious land. Visibility. This is the bit I really want to drive home. I'm going to talk more technical now. What's visibility in the products as we see them? Typically, we're going to be using something called span. Show of hands, people who know what span is, or port mirroring. Okay, yep. So we're taking all the traffic on the network, we're routing it to a collector, that collector then understands the traffic. It's eavesdropping on everything that goes on in your network. That's maybe a scary term, but ultimately, you can send all your traffic to a device and it can interpret what's on the network, what's talking to what protocols are in use, and you might even be able to get a bit of intrusion detection through that, or IPS, depending on products that you use. So you can do this, and this is visibility. So you're not necessarily risking the safety and operation of your network. We've not blocked anything at this point. Once you've got the visibility, you know exactly what's going on in your network. This could be a surprise for some. You can understand all the flows, understand all the hosts. You establish a baseline, and this is a powerful part of visibility that comes kind of after you start. You've got the baseline of what's happening on the network. Then, anything that's new, you don't have to memorize what's going on in your network. The system does that for you. There's going to be a lot going on. So anything that's new, it's going to highlight that to you. You can include that in your baseline, or if a PLC starts port scanning the network, you maybe want to know about that. You start maybe getting a couple of quick wins from visibility and the baseline. But there's a pitfall. You need to make sure this data doesn't overwhelm your network. So I said should earlier on, or something fluffy like that. This is not a real term, I just made this up. Network overwhelm, might be real, but I feel like I made it up. Here's a picture of a network, quite simple. So you've got your visibility collector deployed there, little yellow square up the top, and you've got a few devices on the network talking to each other, that's the red lines. So there's traffic going here and there. You introduce a span, an R span, which is remote span, so traffic can be sent from faraway switches to the central collector. Suddenly you've got a problem on this 100 meg link that I've highlighted, because traffic that was never intended to go over that link is now being duplicated that way. You're going to have a lot more traffic on your network. So This is where you might think you're doing something safe that turns out to be harmful, and you've essentially denial of service yourself. Oops. So we come in with something like this. This is kind of a more common thing where you deploy multiple collectors, and you'll have a central aggregation center where all the lightweight data from the sensors, the collectors, goes back to. So just trying to highlight that visibility should be low impact, and if you're aware of the caveats, it definitely should be low impact. Another pitfall, more collectors might be more money depending on what vendor you go for. So again, just keeping an eye on what to watch out for when you're doing your own research. Moving on to network segmentation. Got a nice wee picture of another OT network. This will probably be familiar to a lot of people. All your devices are on the same subnet, connected to the same switch network, and everything can see everything else. We want to really be moving away from that as much as possible. If you've already segmented, good job. You're already well on the way to doing the right thing. A couple of options for doing this. Bring in a firewall, run all your traffic through it, create new subnets, move the hosts out, separate them, and this is going to be possible in a lot of cases, but there's going to be protocols you use on the AOT network that are broadcast, or they don't go across layer 3, and that's going to be a problem. There's another option where the firewall sits in line within the network and all traffic goes through it, but it's running at layer 2. It's transparent. A lot of firewalls in the next generation space will do this, and if you're worried about bringing segmentation to your OT network because risk aversion, you can run this with a wide open policy. It's not ideal, but at the very least it gets the firewall in. You can start building your policy. You can build it piece by piece by piece until you have a fully functional policy. You can take advantage of next generation feature sets like IPS or IDS. There's visibility that comes through the firewall as well. When speaking to a vendor, check that they support OT protocols. Modbus, DNP3, etc. The list is huge. I'm not going to go through them all. Another thing to consider here, once you've got a firewall in line, it can potentially understand, I'll pick an example, Modbus, which I've done some work with recently. If it understands the protocols, it can allow that in and out, but if it's good enough, it can also potentially limit what access is allowed. Can you perform write operations? Because Modbus is clear text in a lot of cases over TCP. So firewall could really bring advantages for controlling traffic going between your levels. Caveat, layer 2 design, the transparent firewall. I know a lot of you are probably like, yes, the answer to my problems. I would advise against it because so many features disappear on these devices as soon as you turn on the transparent, put it in a transparent mode. And I know of a fair few occasions where doing it this way leads to regret further down the line. So yeah, it's possible you might want to just keep your layer 2 processes in separate subnets each, as opposed to putting every device behind a firewall. Sorry, one final point. If the firewall's scary, you can do... Sorry. If a firewall's scary, or you want to do it a different way, there is switch fabrics, but they typically lack a lot of features, and they involve replacing probably most of your switches, if not all. So it can be quite pricey, but it's another option if you want to go further than firewalls, or if firewalls just aren't for you for whatever reason. So coming back, this next bit, I was talking about setting some traps. So I'll tell you what I mean now. Want to introduce a couple of terms here, maybe. Got honeypots and canaries. Show of hands for people who know what I'm going to say. Okay, a few people, right. So for those who don't, I would define them. So this is how I would distinguish the two. A honeypot is about distracting an attacker, saying, hey, come over here, I've got some resources you can hack, come and steal this stuff, while distracting them from the rest of your good stuff that you don't want them touching. Whereas a canary kind of sits and blends in with the background, just waiting for an attacker to come to it, and so it can then send up an alarm. realistically, as far as this goes, we'll consider them functionally identical because they pretend to be real infrastructure, but they're not. They're there to draw, they're there to be probed, but they're not part of your production. Traffic doesn't go to these servers, so if traffic does turn up at the servers, that's a bit of a cause for concern. And they're there to kind of act as trip sensors. So you'll probably be familiar with the idiom of, as a defender, all you have to do is make one mistake and the attackers are in. The good news, as good as news gets there, once the attackers are in, all they have to do is make one mistake and you've got them, and you can kick them out again. If you don't have anything watching the network for them, though, you'll never catch them. So, yeah, something to think about there. When you're speaking to your vendor, if you're looking at these technologies, make sure you get something that can mimic OT. There is definitely a few in the market that can do this. And lastly, and this is maybe something a bit too far for OT, especially if you're starting out, these solutions are going to set off an alarm. You can tie that in with other security solutions like your segmentation, and you can isolate a host. You can shut an attacker down automatically. You can remediate as these things occur. But I appreciate that automatically doing anything in an OT environment, especially denying access, can come back to that risk aversion. It's there if you want it. So there's a few things, more than a few things I've glossed over, and the first one's on purpose, patching. In an OT environment, you're going to be running all sorts of weird and wacky devices that don't have patches. The vendor's never released one, or you can't patch it because you patch the OS but the application breaks, or the vendor no longer exists to release a patch. So I didn't mention patching because it's not a universal fix. If you can patch, please do, but not relevant for what I'm talking about here. Endpoint agents, very similar reasoning here. Not a lot of PLCs will take an endpoint agent. Not a lot of your older devices running a Windows or a Linux OS will take up-to-date endpoint software, so there's no point really doing that. So there needs to be another way. Didn't mention a SIEM, security incident correlation from all your security sources. If you're putting in multiple security tools, you're probably going to want one of these, but it doesn't differ from the IT network. You might even want to use your organization's IT SIEM to send data through to correlate any potential security incident from start to finish. So I didn't mention it because I didn't feel I could fit it in the time. And vulnerability management, another one I'm going to pick here. It can be a deep topic, this one, but I wanted to kind of highlight something. If you've got visibility, and I've seen these visibility tools being able to determine this device is a PLC. It's made by Siemens. It's this model, it's running this software, and here's its serial number. So you can actually get a lot of intelligence out of the network just by watching the traffic. Couple that with a firewall. Well, you've got a firewall, and it's got OT protocol signatures. It's got OT IPS signatures. So you know the vulnerabilities. You know you've got the signatures. You can patch that device in effect without patching it. You set it up so that if any attacker does try and hit that device with a vulnerability, your enforcement point stops it. So you don't have to patch the device, you patch the network instead, because you're deploying up-to-date tooling on the network, and it can be patched, it can be updated within maintenance windows, obviously. So something to consider there. Come back to a wee summary here, in case you've maybe forgotten what I was talking about at the top. Visibility. Try and focus on this. It should be low impact. It should get you a lot of intelligence. It should give you a steer on where to go next and where to focus, especially if you are not as familiar with your OT environment as you should be or as you would like to be. Get your baseline, because that's going to be very informative, especially as things change. Introduce enforcement points. They don't have to go into full lockdown mode, because that's difficult and it's scary and it's hard to do. Difficult. But you can build your policy as time goes on, because the visibility will tell you what traffic is happening, and you can say that's allowed, put in a rule to allow it. And then add some deception technology. If you're not watching for an attacker, you're not going to see them. don't put all your money into protection, because when, we always use the word when, cybersecurity guys love to use the word when now rather than if, when they get in, you've no way of knowing. And it's much better to have a tool that says, oh, they've been on the network for an hour, as opposed to some random event log or happenstance. It's like, oh, we discovered an attacker, they've been in for months, and it was really by accident we found them. Plenty of stories like that. So yeah, that's kind of a summary of what I want to start with when I'm going to secure an OT network. And from that, move on to any questions that people have. Pop on my earphones so I can hear. Get a mic on. So show of hands. Oh, someone over the back there.
Just raise your hand if you have a question.
Hi there. In the IT space, network segmentation is obviously considered a very classical approach by some. They're moving towards zero trust.
Yeah.
How do you think zero trust fits into the operational technology space?
I'm one for zero trust all over. I did a talk at Digit last year in Edinburgh about zero trust, and again, it was a bit navel gazing, a bit, yeah, again, vendor agnostic, but zero trust, that's the direction to aim in. You don't buy a zero trust, you don't have zero trust tomorrow. It's a methodology you build through and that you continue to finesse as time goes on, to the point where it's kind of just like adding a VLAN or adding a new device to the network. It's that easy, but the uplift to get there can be quite hard. Bringing in your enforcement points, like I've been mentioning, that is the kind of basis that's going to come. It's going to bring you towards zero trust. But if you're targeting zero trust from the outset, I'm so proud of you. You know, that's great to have that goal, but it's not day one. It's day 3 or 4. You know, it's something to aim for, though. Yeah, definitely zero trust if you can aim for it. Or I talked about the concept of no trust, which is rather than spending a lot of time and effort, because you know, to give zero trust, you have to have identity, ideally, to understand what's on the network, to give the right access. If you have certain applications, devices that all they need is say an internet connection, less relevant for OT, just give them an internet connection, because they're not going to be able to touch any of your stuff. It's a bit simple, but it means you don't have to deploy lots and lots of complicated technologies to bring you zero trust. But yes, zero trust, definitely, if you can aim for that, do that. I just thought initially OT networks generally lack any form of enforcement beyond the border between IT and OT. And in a lot of cases, unlike applications and processes are running on the same networks, and it's a hacker's lateral movement wet dream.
Thank you.
Oh dear.
Hi, Ryan. Great presentation, by the way. Great presentation.
Are you gonna make me
Question.
cry?
No. It's a good, honestly, very good, Ryan. What I was going to ask, you introduced the concept of DMZ here, and I think I would be curious for you to tell us what you see the most deployed in the DMZ to remove the connections between the OT and IT. So you had on one of the slides, you talked about Historian. So Historian is one of those ways where you can take the data from OT and use that data with the IT environment and publish it in your Power BI, whatever. What other technologies you see to proxy the communication between OT and IT where you need to do that?
You've unleashed a can of worms there, my man. Well, it's proxies, obviously. The way all the technology is moving, there's a lot of cloud coming in, and there's even the concept of cloud SCADA, which, you know, that's where this Purgy model just falls down and just makes no sense, because the cloud isn't even mentioned. So you've got the likes of, you could be putting in just a generic web access proxy in the DMZ for these applications that need to phone home. There's the likes of privileged access management. So talking maybe less about data out, more data in, or a scenario, in fact, you've got a PLC right down at level 1, and it's maybe, it's owned by Siemens. Siemens maybe designed your system and put it all in, and you're not actually allowed to touch it. You just operate it, and you call them when something's wrong. They need to connect in, and they might do something daft, like throw in a 4G router that plugs directly into the OT network. And that's a terrible idea for a lot of reasons. But you could explore another paradigm where maybe they come in through some form of VPN or VDI, and they can then connect to your PAM solution, privileged access management. So this allows you to effectively proxy access into your OT network, and you can also chaperone what they're doing, so you can see what they're doing, and you've got a big disconnect button, so that if they do something you deem untrusted, you can just cut them off there and then. And really, the main part of this, rather than talking about specifics, I know that was a specific, it's introduce steps. Think about the model, and it might be that, well, a workstation is going to program a PLC. The workstation's in level 3, the PLC's in level 1. Oh, we've broken Purdue. Right, pack the network up, we'll go home, we'll do something else tomorrow. No, it's an exception. You accept the exception. You understand the risk and say that's fine. Or it's not fine, you come do something else. But introduce points of enforcement, introduce touch points, don't just allow direct comms. They come in via VPN, they connect to a PAM solution, they go onto a workstation. That workstation programs the PLC. The PAM solution has chaperoning as an option and could be tied into an identity service. So you've introduced all these checks, all these little bits, rather than just one connection, they're in, done, you're screwed. All these checks, every hurdle you put in will help prevent an attacker. It'll slow them down. So, yeah. Anything further? Do you want me to elucidate on that anymore? No, it's good. the mic's off. All right. Remind me to slip that guy a $5.
Any other questions?
Right.
Okay, please give Ryan a round of applause.
Thank you all.